Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 3, Halacha 1, Part 3 of the Shir in the Art Scroll 26b2. Today we're getting into melons. All of the conversation that's going to be coming up in these Gemaras is really laying the foundation and the groundwork for what happens when you start to try to plant melons in either an area between a walkway or where you have one field, one little patch, garden patch on one side of a walkway and another, and what happens if you're trying to do it within these patches. We know that from the Mishnah it says that there's a problem when you try to plant turnips because the leaves get to be so big. So all of what's going to be coming up is really going to be other kinds of vegetables. It's not going to particularly mention the turnips, but it will mention the melons. And so, a lot of times in Gemara, we have sort of, instead of deductive reasoning, which we're used to, where, you'll sort of state a conclusion and then you'll go and you'll prove it. A lot of times in the Gemara, it'll be inductive, where it will state a lot of things and then it will sort of say something, and you have to go back and infer that what they were talking about in the beginning was really what is connected in the end. So in the end, we're going to be talking about melons, but when you go through each one of these things, and I'll highlight that, it's going to be relevant to a vegetable with very, very big leaves or melons. Now, again, the idea about all of this is that we have to have this visual indicator that this and that's planted next to it is not going to be visually like, oh, you've mixed up this field. That's what's going to be coming about with this. There's another inquiry that is continuing with this conversation from part 2 of the Shir, and it asks a question. It says, what is the law with regard to whether one can clear out an area measuring 6 by 6 tefachim in between the beginning of 2 fields of Yerushalmi, which then continuously narrow until the fields meet. Now, imagine that you have a square, and instead of in a square, it's going to make like a sort of like razor blade shape where, one side is going to just get longer and the other side is going to connect to it, but it's going to also sort of, veer out so that you're ending up with a trapezoid, and basically, one end is going to be much longer than the shorter end, and the sides that connect the box, one is going to be much longer. So it's going to be like a razor blade, and effectively you have it where it's narrowing. So the question is, if you have 2 fields and you have different varieties of vegetables, Yerushalmi, these do have to be separated by 6 tefachim. That's something that we know, but that's not what the question is. The question here is when you're separating it and you're now narrowing this gap so that, sort of, in the edge of this razor blade, there's going to be much less than 6 tefachim, right? It's going to be narrowing down to a point on this trapezoid. It's not a square, it's not a rectangle. It's now a trapezoid. So it has 4 sides, but one side is much, much longer than the other, and the part that connects it sort of just, elongates to connect it into a box. So within this area, yes, you do have a 6 by 6 tefach area. That's going to be fine, but that's not what it's asking about. What it's trying to ask about is what about in this gap that you've left unplanted that narrows? So now within this gap, you have less than 6 tefachim. Why is that going to matter? Well, what happens if on one side of this patch you're going to have turnip leaves, or what's going to happen if you have melons? So the question is also going to be that, before we were talking about, what happens if you're having, grain, you have 2 rows of grain. Well, we know over there that's going to have to be separated by 2 amos. And over here, they're going to let you narrow it over on the grain. So we talked about, you're trying to plant, patch of grain. You have in the middle, you have a 2 amos by 2 amos gap, and it can narrow. Why? Because it's showing now the rows are, there's going to be still an unplanted gap, but it's still showing that it's not mixed. That's going to be the question now. The question is going to be, what about if you have 2 fields of Yerushalmi, and it's going to be sort of narrowing down. So the Gemara is going to answer and to say, of course, this is permitted, and even when the area from which one species draws nourishment for its cultivated area encounters the area from which another species draws nourishment from its cultivated area, such as when 5 species are planted within a 6x6 patch, you say, as stated in our Mishnah, that it is permitted to plant numerous species. And then here, concerning 2 fields of Yerushalmi, where at first one cultivation area does not encounter the other cultivation area, is it not certain that these 2 fields can be planted in this fashion? So what it's saying is, look, what about having where you can have a shared area where now it narrows down, but now this gap gets smaller and smaller to a point? Well, certainly within that, you're going to have part of the space have shared nutrition. Some of field A is going to be drawing nutrition from the plants in field B and also from the ground. Now, before we were talking about in part 1 and part 2 of this year, we were talking about very clean boxes. And the clean boxes were always separated enough where there was a 1.5 tefachim area, and that they were basically saying that, okay, within this planted area, it gets enough nourishment and there's enough gap that it has nourishment within, even if it's going to be a shared area, and 2 within this gap might be sharing nutrition. But over here, if it's going to narrow to a point, certainly they're going to be sharing nutrition. Now, there's another reading on all this that's going to be saying, no, you have to have 3 tefachim. Why? Because plant A in this first patch of 1.5 tefachim is going to have just 1.5 tefachim nutrition gap just for it. And now plant B is going to have 1.5 tefachim. That's going to make 3. So that it has its own nutrition area. Well, what this is saying by narrowing it down is that, these 2 fields meeting, you're basically going to have a shared nutrition gap. The gap is going to have overlap where species A is going to be drawing nutrition not only from where it's planted, but from that surrounding area. And within that surrounding area, since it gets to a point, it's going to be, certainly less than 1.5 tefachim, and you're going to have 2 things that are going to be next to it. So it's going to look at this in another way, and this Gemara is going to be saying, indeed, there's no question that this is permitted, and indeed, there is no need for this line of inquiry about 2 fields of vegetables that are going to be separated at first by 6 tefachim. Rather, we're going to be asking as follows: what is the law with regard to whether one can clear out an area measuring a bet rova in between the beginning of 2 grain fields, which then continuously narrow for the 2 fields to meet? So what it's going to be saying over here is that, well, wait a second. If you're going to have 2 vegetable fields, right, and at first it's separated by a 6x6 tefach area, even though it's going to be in this trapezoid shape and like a razor blade and then go to a point, and the bottom side of field A is going to be much longer, and the top part of field B is going to be much shorter, but you have a 6x6 gap, and then you have this very, very long edge that's going to connect this empty unplanted gap between field A and field B to where field A and field B are going to meet. But the point that this is saying is that this 6x6 tefach gap is showing that the farmer visually was showing that this and that are not mingled together. That's what it's showing. So even though it's going to encounter the same cultivation area, because you've started off with a 6x6 gap, even though it's going to narrow until it gets to a single point, it's going to be visually showing a difference. And by the way, we got a lot of this from these Rosh Tor laws. The Rosh Tor laws are going to be 2 triangles or 2 diamonds that are going to meet at a point, and then you're going to have an unplanted gap, and anybody walking by and looking at this is going to see that this and that has an unplanted gap, and field A and field B are not going to be mixed species. So again, it's always not going to be mingled. Now, the Maraful is going to be talking about this like this. He's going to be saying that to this, a bet rova is going to be the amount necessary to separate between 2 fields of grain. And that, by the way, is going to be contrast to vegetables, Yerushalmi, which are only going to need 6 tefachim. So bet rova is going to be for grain. 6 tefachim is going to be for Yerukot. By the way, why 6 tefachim? In the temple measurement, it's going to be the amma. That's 1 amma. So there's 2 different measurements in the halacha. There's going to be a 5 tefach amma, and there's a 6 tefach amma. And we know that in the beginning of Maseket Erevin, it talks about that the laws of Kilayim are going to be using the bigger amma, the bigger measurement. That's why we're talking about a 6x6 tefach. That's where we're getting this from. And so basically what we're saying is that, with regards to the bet rova, for grain, the bet rova separation, would be required only at first, and then it's going to narrow to a single point. So, one is asking the question, says the Mara Fulda, is perhaps, this leniency is only going to apply to your coat, and then regarding grain, perhaps that would be more strict. And, basically what it's saying is that if, you have it where the grain patch is going to have this required mandate of 1 bet rova, and then it's going to do the same thing the vegetable field did. It went to this trapezoid shape. It meets at, this unplanted area at a gap, and then, right after this, trapezoid shape area, you have field A and field B. And really it's going to be asking, is this going to apply or not? And this is really going to be the question the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say that even in regard to a piece of land measuring 6 tefachim by 6 tefachim, for which one incurs lashes by Torah law when leaving less than that amount of space between fields of different species of Yerukot. So again, if you're doing less than 6 tefachim, this Gemara is saying that you get lashes. You're going to get lashes because you violated the law of makot. You're getting makot because you violated the laws of Kilayim. And it continues. Gemara continues. It says that you say that it is nonetheless permitted to plant 2 fields of Yerukot adjoining each other as long as they're first separated by that distance. And then here, regarding a bet rova for which one does not incur lashes by Torah law when leaving less than amount of space between fields of different species of grains, is it not certain that 2 fields of grain can be adjoined when it's first separated by a bet rova? In other words, what this is saying is that this leniency is going to apply concerning Yerukot, where the separation of 6 tefachim is going to be biblically required. And this is going to apply to grain as well, because where the required separation of a bet rova is going to be a rabbinic leniency. So you can ask the question, you can say, well, the Gemara derived earlier that this leniency concerning Yerukot from the 5 species of vegetables that could be planted in the 6x6 gap where they're going to end up drawing nourishment from common ground. Again, that's if you're going to be going by the 1.5 tefach space and you're going to be doing it within the gap. The other way to do it is if you're going to go with the 3 tefach area where there is no shared nutrition, then you're planting along the edge of this 6x6 box. But over here, the Gemara is going to be going over this other law concerning grain. And we're trying to learn that now from the law concerning Yerukot, where, the question is, can you use the law for Yerukot to derive it onto grain? The answer is that even where you're looking at the law of vegetables, the leniency allowing 5 species of grain in a bet rova is itself known only through the law regarding the vegetables. So since a law concerning Yerukot is going to be the basis for this derivation, the Mara Fulda explains that the Gemara is choosing to derive the leniency of narrowing continuously concerning grain from the very same law of Yerukot. In other words, in all of these cases that we've been covering in Chapter 3, Halacha 1, it all is derived from the vegetables. And if you want to look at grain, you have to derive those from the vegetables over here. So in summary, the Gemara is concluding that a lenient ruling is going to be applied for all of these inquiries. And, first, 5 species of grain can be planted in a bet rova. And second, 6 tefachim are going to be necessary between the fields of vegetables. And that's only going to be at the beginning. And so if you have a 6x6 area that's unplanted, it can narrow until the two fields meet. And then the third is going to be that the bet rova is going to be necessary between the fields of grain only at the beginning. That, by the way, is going to be a d'Rabbanan. And it's, after you've left this unplanted area of the bet rova, you can narrow that until the fields meet. And that's all going to be derived from the field of vegetables. Now, regarding these gaps, what is going to be when you start to plant things with like melons or things that have very big leaves? We saw in the Mishnah that this is going to be an exception, that all of these laws apply except for something that has these big leaves. Why? Because that's going to be, it can become so big that, or the melons can spread out because they're growing on vines, that now it can look and grow into another area and look like a mixed field. But regarding regular types of vegetables or regular types of grain, that's not going to be a concern. But the Mishnah does note that there is an exception. Now, we're going to go back to this patch, and now we're going to be dealing with this area of the 6x6 tefach patch. It's going to be surrounded by a raised border. What is the raised border? This is going to be a walking path, and this walking path is going to be 1 tefach. That's the minimum size of a walking path in the halacha. Why is 1 tefach, which is a handbreadth, going to be the minimum size of a footpath for a walking path? And the answer is that if you take your hand and make it into a fist, and you hold up the ball of your foot where, before where your toes meet, that's the widest part of your foot, you'll see that the width of your foot is also the width of your hand. Hashem made it that way. And so that is going to be the minimum size for a footpath. Anything less is not a footpath. Why? Because your foot won't fit on it, right? Your foot will be too big. You'll be stepping into the planted area. So we are talking about a raised border, and this is going to be a slightly different scenario, and we're going to be talking about some derivations, and again, what's going to be happening when you start planting other kinds of things. In the beginning, we're going to be talking about regular kinds of vegetables where it's going to look like it's not mishmashed or mixed together. It's going to be a field that is going to follow the laws, so you have proper spacing, you don't get into Kilayim problems, and then it's going to sum up and say, well, what about if you're doing this with melons? Because then you end up with problems. The Gemara says that Rabbi Nasa asked a question, says, is it not logical to say that on top of this raised border, if this border were now to measure 2 tefachim wide, is it permitted to plant 2 species? In other words, one immediately adjacent to the other, so that you could get 24 species to be planted around this entire raised border. Gemara doesn't answer that. So we saw this before. What happens if you have a field? What happens if you have a fence that has a flat top and then another field, and you want to plant on this flat top? Well, in that case, that fence was raised at least 10 tefachim off the ground, and it's going to be at least 4 tefachim wide. And the answer that it was saying was, yes, you can plant on there, and it won't be Kilayim because it is high enough and wide enough to visually be recognized as its own thing. Question is going to be like this. If you plant within a footpath now that is going to be raised, elevated above the other patches on the ground, again, this is a Talmudic question. This is not necessarily a practical question, but it's sharpening our mind to try to understand what's going to be the law here. And again, in order to make this work, you have to have the squares are going to meet at a point. So they're going to be a little bit like a chessboard, where the chessboard is going to have black squares and white squares, and you imagine that the white squares might be unplanted, and the black squares are going to be planted, or vice versa. And the chessboard meets in a point for each square. So in order to do that, you can't plant these next to each other, because if you plant a black square next to a black square, you have a Kilayim problem. But they can meet at a point. We have the Rosh Torah laws. So the question is, can you fit doing that, where now you have this raised border. It's going to be elevated above the vegetable patch to the left or the right, and can you now fit these other species? But the Gemara doesn't respond to it, doesn't answer. And Rabbi Kanievsky is saying about this that this is implying that Rabbi Nasa is asking a rhetorical question, and in essence he's asserting that this is in fact permitted. So, by the way, the Chazan Ish in his Kilayim 721 is going to be positing that in this instance, this is going to be a statement. This is not really a question. So both the Chazan Ish and Rabbi Kanievsky are going to be saying that this is going to be a statement that you can do it. It's not really a rhetorical question so much. So Gemara doesn't answer that. So I assume that you're allowed to do that. The next question regarding this Mishnah, Rabbi Nasa is going to ask another question, and he's going to say that if one put 4 poles into the ground at 4 corners of a 6 by 6 tefach area, and then he's fixing a braid of reeds from pole to pole. Effectively, he's making a 6 by 6 area in the middle of a field, and he's now creating, in a way, like a fence. He's put poles on the corners of these fields, and he's putting a braid of reeds connecting the poles. And we do something like this if you have a metal sukkah, right? You take the piece of rope and you're now going to be wrapping it around the metal sukkah bars 3 times, and you're creating because of the laws of Lavud, you're basically creating, it's going to be like a wall. And so over here, you could be doing the same thing. What's going to be happening now, you take your 4 poles, you put them in the corner of the 6 by 6 tefach area, and now you're creating this row of braid of reeds from pole to pole. And effectively, this Gemara is saying that you're cordoning off a 6 by 6 area in the middle of a field, and then you're going to plant a different species inside that area. And the question, like says this Gemara, is how far must the species in that area extend? In other words, the 6 by 6 area is going to be seen like a fenced off area, and the question is that, what can you put on the other side of that fenced area? In other words, how far is your setback going to be? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say this can be derived from that which Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Imi said in explanation of this Mishnah. It says, for concerning the Tanna Kama's ruling that only one species can be planted in a 6 by 6 patch surrounded by a border, they said that one can understand that the Mishnah's ruling is resulting from the fact that the species planted on the borders is going to reduce the permitted planting area of the 6 by 6 patch. Now, that's going to allow only one species to be planted there. And we covered this before. If you have this 1 tefach raised border that surrounds your 6 by 6 area, there's a difference between if you have this border and if you don't have the border. If you don't have the border, you're going to look at part 1 of the shear, and you can plant within it 5 species. Now, if you do have the border, now you're going to be able to plant just 1 species. And by the way, your planted area within that 6 by 6 area shrinks down to 3 tefachim, because you have to have enough setback so that you can plant things on the other side of this footpath border. The question is going to be, well, what happens if you put in these poles? Are you going to be having to shrink this area? And the Gemara says that this tells us from this other law regarding the border and this footpath that concerning this case, a 6 by 6 tefach cordoned off area in the middle of the field. Now, the Gemara is going to investigate this further because this seems a little bit interesting. It says, to what extent can we diminish the planting area of this 6 by 6 cordoned off area? And the Vilna Goan says about this that although we've seen that the entire 6 by 6 area does not have to be planted, perhaps there's a minimum amount that must be planted in order for the planted area to be significant, considered distinct. And that's really what this question is asking. In other words, if you're going to be creating this gap and you have the poles on the 4 corners and you're going to put a reed across these bars, what's going to be the minimum amount where this in the middle is going to be seen as something distinctive, so that if you're planting something on the other side of it, it wouldn't look like Kilayim? And Gemara is going to answer. And this, by the way, seems very odd because we learned that a fence is just going to separate this area from that area. The question is going to be, well, isn't this really just going to be like a fence? So why shouldn't you be able to just, plant it in full or plant in, 5 different species like in part 1 of the shear? Why are you looking at having to do a setback like in part 2 of the shear? So the Gemara is going to answer all this, and it's going to say, let us derive the resolution to this question from this teaching in a Baraisa. It says, regarding holes in the ground that are a tefach deep and a tefach wide and a tefach long, that one may plant in proximity to each hole 3 varieties of seeds. That would be one on the outside edge of one side, one on the opposite edge, and one in the middle. And so, in other words, inside the hole itself, it can be planted with something else. And since the 1-by-1 area in the hole is completely planted, it's considered a domain in itself. And basically, then all 3 plantings are going to be distinct, and they're not going to require separation. And this tells us that one may diminish the planting area of the 6-by-6 area only until a tefach, and if one wishes to plant an area smaller than that, it is forbidden. So what this is really saying is this is saying that you can plant the area in the middle, but you can't go less than 1 tefach. So we were looking at this a little bit backwards. In other words, saying like, look, this is a fence. You can plant something in the middle. This is going to be like the case where you have species A on a raised part, you have species B on the other side of this gap, and within this gap you have a divot, a hole in there, and that hole is going to be planted with species C. The question is going to be, really what this is trying to teach us is, well, what's going to be the minimum amount that you have to plant within this cordoned off area with these bars so it's going to look like a significant field. It's not going to look like a mishmash. And the answer is going to be that you can go smaller and smaller and smaller if you choose to, up to a tefach. You have to at least plant a tefach. You have less than the 1-by-1 area, you're not going to consider this as a distinct area. The planted area has to be considered an independent domain, and it has to be distinct from the area outside of that. And something not less than 1 tefach by 1 tefach is going to meet that criteria. You can have within this 6-by-6 area more than 1 tefach, but if you have something on one side of this bar, these bars, and something within these bars, within the 6-by-6 tefach, and you're going to plant less than 1 tefach by 1 tefach, then it's not going to be considered substantial enough. And this is another theme that comes up again and again and again. It has to be, these fields have to appear not to be mixed. Certainly the bars with the separation does show that, and certainly any Morris-Ein problem would be resolved because you walk by and you see this kind of separation. But you also have to have where the field that you're planting is always going to have this thing where it's going to seem to be substantial enough, and you're going to have something substantial next to something. So the Gemara is going to go on to holes in a field, and it's going to address another section of the Baraisa that rules that 4 species can be planted in a hole 1 tefach deep, with each variety facing a different direction. Now, what are we getting into? Well, we're going to be getting into a barren area, and this is how this is going to work. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Bar Chana and Rabbi Shimon Bar Nashea says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and it says that they taught in the Baraisa that 4 varieties of seeds can be planted there only where the plants are leaning toward a barren area. Otherwise, the seeds may not be planted in this way. You have to have a barren area. We covered this before when we were talking about the fences, and maybe that's why this is next to this conversation about the poles, because over there we saw that you have a tendency to get these barren areas next to a fence because you don't want to water along the fence because the fences might be made of wood and you might rot out your fence, or if they're made out of stone, you might turn the watered area into mud and it might undermine the structure of your wall. So there was a tendency to leave an unwatered area and create a barren area next to it. Now we're talking about a barren area once again. So the qualification of this is saying that there has to be a barren area. The Marafulda is saying that it is repeated about this barren area in order to teach the law of the 1 tefach deep hole. Rabbi Kanievsky is going to explain about it like this. He's going to say that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is qualifying this part of the brisa, which permits one variety of seeds inside a one tefach hole and one on each side of it. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is explaining that it's permitted to plant only two sides of the hole. That's going to be the east side and the west side. And the other sides, like the north side and the south side, have to stay unplanted. And the Vilna Goan is going to be saying that, this teaching by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish does have a bearing on this sugya, and basically it's explaining with regards to the number of patches. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is asserting that the Mishnah is actually going to be talking about a barren area, not a patch among other patches. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, says the Vilna Goan, is trying to look at this Mishnah and say that this is not talking about a case where you have a whole bunch of different vegetable fields. We're talking about a case where you have a barren area. Now you're planting within a barren area. It means that you don't have anything on the other side of this shared barren space. You have to go out of the barren space to start being able to plant. And so what is this trying to do? This is trying to say that this is not a patch among other patches. That's going to be the idea. So the Gemara is going to go regarding back to this one tefach wide border on a 6x6 patch. So where we're leaving off on this with, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's point, he's saying that this Mishnah is just talking about a barren area that you've decided to plant with vegetables, and that's how you fit all these species. The sugya is going to move on now, and it's going to go back to the 6x6 patch, and you have the one tefach border. That's going to be your footpath, and it's going to be a walking area. So Rabbi Zera says about this, and again, by the way, there are two sets of halachot. There's going to be the 6x6 tefach area that does not have a border, and then there's the 6x6 tefach area that does have a border, and you want to plant on the other side of the border. So Rabbi Zera is saying that the rabbis regarded each and every tefach of a raised border as an independent domain. And the Gemara is going to be wondering, it's going to say, but if so, there should be an allowance to plant 25 different species in the Mishnah's case of a 6x6 tefach area surrounded by a border. How do you get to 25? Well, if you're going to be saying that, basically, by the way, the Mishnah is going to be permitting only 13. How are you getting up to 25? So since each tefach is going to be regarded as an independent domain, if you're going to be reading it like this, you're going to be able to permit the corner species to touch each other. And then, the question is, why is it necessary to have to separate between species at all? And the 6 species should be allowed, on each border, one right next to each other, without any separation. And the 13 that we covered in this Mishnah, this is creating a 1x1 tefach, square in the corner, which, by the way, we're not allowed to actually surround with patch. And by the way, we covered this earlier in chapter 2 in Kilayim, where we had this 3-2-1-2-1 pattern, where you're trying to plant within a field, and the law over there was that you're not allowed to surround species. So that's where we're going with this. In other words, if you're going to be trying to plant 25, in other words, the unplanted 25th one will be one species in the middle, and then you're surrounding 24 on the side of this walking path. Basically, you're not leaving any gap. And according to this, basically, it's trying to probe that, why can't you just plant 25? The Mishnah says 13. And really where we're going is we're worried that, look, you're not allowed to take a species and surround it with another species. You have to create setbacks, and that way it doesn't look like it's mixed. And if you were to permit 25 in a row without these separations, then basically you are surrounding the species. And it's not enough just to leave a gap at the corners that's unplanted, because let's say you have, one in the middle, and you have, one on the other side of it, one on the other side of it. There's no gap in the middle between the one in the middle and the one on left and right side of it. So effectively, you've surrounded the middle species, and that's going to be a problem. Basically, what we're supposed to be doing is leaving an unplanted area. So Gemara is going to be responding and say, if this is indeed so, then, so that, 6 species should be allowed, on each border, then, it would seem that you should be able to have 25 species. Why not? Why don't we have 25 species? And it's going to basically bring up another point. Rabbi Bun Bar Hia asked in the name of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzchak, and says, but concerning, regarding what we have, in the Mishnah, it says concerning a furrow and a water channel that are 1 tefach deep, one can plant on either side 3 varieties of seeds. One is going to be on one side, one is going to be in the middle, in the gap, and one is going to be on the other side. And the Gemara says that because you have, the one in the middle is going to count like its own domain, and it's going to be substantial enough because it's within a 1 by 1 tefach area. That's what it's trying to teach. Now, the Gemara is going to say, why does the Mishnah teach that only 3 species may be planted there? The Mishnah should say that there can be 5 planted. Why? How do you get to 5? You're going to have 2 on the sides. You're going to have 2 on the east and west side, 2 on the north and south side, and 1 in the middle. That's going to be 5. But the Gemara doesn't say that. The Mishnah doesn't say that. It's saying that you can do 3. We just covered this before. We talked about the Vilna Goan's commentary that you can do 3. So why does it look like you're being able to plant less than all of this? Why can't you just maximize the field and do more? And it says that, the species on this side and the species on that side, and, 1 in the middle, and accordingly, this Mishnah now is not saying 5, it's limiting it down to 3. And by the way, this Mishnah, is limiting it down to 13. If you're not going to leave these gaps, you could plant 25 species. Why didn't the Mishnah say 25? What's this trying to teach us? So another question about this raised border is presented, and Rabbi Bun Bar Hia says in the name of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzchak, and they ask a question: what is the law regarding whether a raised border can save a species of vegetables planted on one side of it from being considered Kilayim, with a row of melon-like vegetables on the other side of it? So in other words, what happens if you have regular vegetables on one side of the border, and the other side you're going to have melons? Well, melons are going to have vines, and they're going to spread out, and they're going to have big leaves, and sometimes they'll have tendrils, and they'll grab onto things with the tendrils. And the Gemara answer says, if even regarding planting seeds among seeds, concerning which we say that even in the worst case scenario, they're saved from the prohibition of Kilayim, if they're separated from one another by 10.5 amos. 10.5 amos, by the way, is pretty big. This is going to be the separation between fields of grain, right? So we talked before about doing a bet rova. Bet rova is going to come out to 10.5 amos. And so it's saying that, nevertheless, the law is that a raised border does not save one species from the other species. Rather, even if a border separates them, the required separation is going to be required. So what is this trying to teach? Well, this is trying to say that if you have a border, and on one side of it you're going to have melons, and you're going to have other types of vegetables on the other side, that you can't rely on it. You have to have a bigger setback. That's what this is trying to teach. So, but you'd say, but wait a second, I have a raised border. Wait a second, my border is going to be enough where it's going to save Kilayim for regular vegetables on one side and regular vegetables on the other side. And the Gemara is going to basically be saying, so how regarding, a row of melon-like vegetables can it be saved from another species of Yerushalmi, only if it's separated by another row of melon-like vegetables by 12 amos. In other words, it's saying, what about the raised border? If you don't have a raised border, you got to set it back by 12 amos. That's going to be basically like a bet rova. And it says, is it not certain that a raised border is not, going to save the vegetables planted on one side and a row of melons on the other side? And, maybe you just need this, in other words, is this raised border going to be enough, or do you have to have this full separation like what we were talking about between separating grain and grain? Separating grain and grain, you have to have a bet rova. And what this is trying to teach is that even if you're using all of these techniques in spacing, even if you're using the separated border, and you have a border between this and that, well, the problem is your melons are going to be different, and it's going to need a different set of setbacks than regular vegetables. That's what this is teaching. And there's a similar question. It's going to say concerning a melon-like vegetable itself. What is the law with regard to whether it can save itself from a Kilayim prohibition if it's planted on top of a border? And we get to this again, right? What about this fence that it's 10 tefachim high, it's 4 tefachim wide, and you have on one side one type of vegetable, and the other side of this fence another kind of vegetable, and now you've decided to plant in this raised fence area that has a flat top? Is that going to save it if you're going to try to plant melons? And Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, if even regarding the planting of seeds of one kind of grain among other seeds of different kind of grain, concerning which we say that they are saved from the prohibition of Kilayim if they're separated from each other by 10.5 amos. So in other words, you have to have this setback for grain. Nevertheless, the law is, says this Gemara, that they are not saved from the prohibition, even if something is planted on top of the border. With regards to the grain, you cannot. But certainly, if you can't do that for the grain, you can't do that for the melon. So the Gemara says, regarding a row of melon-like vegetables that's saved from two similar species, if the species is separated by 8 amos, then is it not certain that it is not saved from being planted on top of this border? And basically, you have to have this required setback no matter what. Now, why is that? Well, these things grow on vines. They can go down the wall, and they can go and grab onto what's ever next to it. That's going to be the problem. So the logic of this Kal V'Homer gets challenged, and Rabbi Yudam, the father of Rabbi Matanya, says that, but this is a valid Kal V'Homer. And, of course, it's not a Kal, is this really a valid Kal V'Homer? And they're basically saying no. And basically what they're saying is that, for the 8 amos separation concerning the melon-like vegetables, this is going to represent a leniency when compared to the cases of grain, which, by the way, for the cases of grain is going to require an 8 or 12 amos area. And that, by the way, is going to be a bet rova. So then, certainly over here, regarding this required separation between two species, even if one is planted on top of this wall, is it possible that concerning melon-like vegetables that the separation may not be necessary at all when it's planted on this border? And the Gemara is going to concede that, if we're going to assume that, only 8 amos are going to be enough for a melon-like vegetable, then the law concerning grains cannot necessarily be applied to these species. In other words, the question is there going to be a shorter gap between the vegetables? There's certainly more than regular Yerushalmi and vegetables, but what about these melons? Is it going to be less than the setback for grain? And the Kal V'Homer is going to be valid according to those who assume that you're going to actually have 12 amos that's going to be required to separate between melon-like species. In other words, there are some that say that you need the full setback like grain, and there are some that are going to say that you don't need as much, you only need 8, and that setback will be fine. And the Gemara says, rather, this is the Kal V'Homer, and this is how it's going to finish up. It's going to say, if even regarding planting seeds of one kind of grain among seeds of another kind of grain, concerning which we say that they are saved from prohibition of Kilayim if they are separated by 10.5 amos. Nevertheless, the law is that they are not saved from prohibition through one of them being planted on top of this flat wall border. Then here, regarding the melon-like species that is saved from a similar species that is separated by a 12 amos gap, is it not certain that it is not saved through being planted on the top of a border and this required separation? In other words, this is going to be the opinion of Hiskia, and it's going to be saying, according to Hiskia, actually, you need 12 amos, and it's going to emerge that melon-like species is going to be treated more stringently than grain. In other words, grain is going to be separated at 10.5 amos. And there was an opinion that says, well, maybe you could do it at less than grain. Maybe you need 8 amos. And Hizkiah is coming back and saying, no. It's actually going to be even more stringent than grain. You actually have to set back different melon species. You have to set them back with an unplanted gap between these two melon-like species. Has to be at least a 12 amos gap. And this Gemara is concluding that on the basis of Kal V'chomer, there's no question that a border is not going to create a separation regarding melon-like vegetables. And basically, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who's going to apply a leniency concerning melon-like species, the question remains whether a border is going to constitute a species or not. Basically, they're saying that because these are vines and these have tendrils and they grab onto things and they have very big leaves, and you're going to be planting 2 species of melon, you have to do a greater setback than grain. Grain is at a bet rova, which is going to be 10.5 amos, and they're saying that 10.5 amos is not enough. And certainly you can't go smaller than that. You can't go to, like, say, 8 amos. You have to go to 12 amos. And what about the border? And basically, Rabbi Yochanan is going to be applying a leniency. The question is going to be, does a border constitute a separation? Rabbi Hizkiah is going to be saying no. So regarding melons, and a couple of really interesting insights about this, when we're talking about this sugya, about the stakes in the ground, we're making this reed fence around it, but there's gaps in it, right? We're playing with the fences here, but this is all dealing with the melons. We know that melons can crawl under this and go. Now, normally you're thinking, oh, well, a fence is a fence. That's it. It's going to separate from Kilayim, nothing to worry about. That's why they're bringing this in, right? That's what you normally think. But the brilliance about this is that the melons are just going to go underneath it. It's not an actual wall. And so does that come and create a separation? It's not. Now, normally we can shrink this size down to 1 tefach and plant something. But now if you're going to be planting melons, that's also not going to count. And that's what we were talking about in the Mishnah. Mishnah is saying, well, turnips and things like that with leaves and obviously now melons, we're going to see that these are going to be the exemptions for these cases. Certainly, the sages are trying to break in our idea that a fence is a fence, don't worry about it, because melons are going to be the issue. Now, they were doing that before. If you have a fence and you have one side is one type of grain field, another type is another type of grain field on the other side of the fence, okay, nothing to worry about. And then in the earlier sugya in chapter 2, where they're talking about a flat top on top of this, and now you're going to plant a third thing on this flat top fence that's going to at least be 4 tefachim wide. Well, they're not going to allow that because that's going to look like an intermingled planting. And why won't they allow that over here on the melons? Well, the melons have this characteristic of vines that are going to go all over the place. They're going to spill over this fence, and they're going to grab onto other things with their tendrils. So whatever's on both sides of it, it's going to grab onto it. And that's the point, right? They're trying to say that, hey, melons are different. It requires a greater setback. And regarding your boundaries, maybe the boundaries you were used to thinking about in the rest of the halacha are not going to apply with melons. And that is really some of the brilliant points that the sages, I think, have here and organized it this way so that we see it sort of breaks our stereotype thinking where we're like, oh, a fence is a fence, just move on, don't worry about it. And these are all going to be cases where normally, yeah, that would be a fence, it would be a barrier, it would be a halachic barrier, but not in this case. And I think that's the cleverness. Have a great day.